Mr. Rozental, thank you for coming Atlantic Dialogue Television. And we are talking about turmoil in the world here at this conference. Is there turmoil sustainable in Latin America? Is there a chance to stop the violence in Latin America?
I think it depends very much on the country.
Let's start with your country, Mexico.
Okay. With my country, Mexico, which is probably right now one of the more violent and more difficult countries where the situation has deteriorated considerably over the years, mainly because of organized crime, drug trafficking. I think that it's going to be a while before we can reverse the tendency, which has been to have more rather than less violence. We have a new government, Mr. López Obrador, who campaigned and was elected on the promise of changing that situation. But at the end of his first year of government, which was last December 1st, the situation has worsened, not improved.
Yes, as one sees on television all the time. And I always ask myself, do I want to go on vacation in Mexico?
A lot of people ask the question, but we still get millions and millions of visitors that come to Mexico, because I think fundamentally this is a localized issue, mainly along the U.S.-Mexico border, where most of the organized criminal activity takes place, and in some of the southern states, but not the ones where tourists tend to go, not at the beaches and so on. Those are still fine and safe, and so is Mexico City.
You can go to Guadalajara and you can go to all these
There's
places.
no problem there.
How much, you mentioned the American-Mexican border, how much of the violence is a responsibility also of the United States? Now they don't let anybody in anymore, or very difficult, as we know, all these camps and all these procedures of asking for asylum, and they all remain in Mexico. So isn't there, a source of crime growing in Mexico because of that blockade?
Definitely. I think it's a shared problem, not only because of what the Trump administration is doing regarding closing the border, but also, I think, fundamentally because Mexico is a country where you're not allowed to own firearms. And the U.S. is a country where everyone owns firearms. And so the movement of weapons from the U.S. to Mexico is one of the serious problems, because that's what arms the organized criminal cartels and so on. And I think that the Americans realize that, but like many things in the U.S., it's a domestic political issue. They've not been able even to reinstate the assault weapons ban that they had some years ago. And I think that as long as the U.S. is, one, an exporter, major exporter of weapons, and two, the major consumer of drugs.
That's, I just wanted to...
And we're right there at the south of the U.S., it's going to be very difficult to change the dynamics. We're hopeful. I think that in the case of the U.S., states that have already liberalized their laws regarding drugs and marijuana and so on will change a federal policy which still remains to prohibit all of these substances.
But the Mexican people, do they have still confidence in the government? If you look at the gun battles the other day, they wanted to arrest somebody who was important, the child of...
The son
of
Chapo.
Voila, they wanted to arrest him, and I remember these images. They had him, and they let him go because they were afraid of more violence. Isn't it terrible if you see that the government is, ceding, the field to crime elements?
From my perspective, what I would say, it was a very poor decision to do that. But perceptions in Mexico among public opinion is that he did the right thing. The president did the right thing.
To save lives.
To save lives, because these cartel members had gone to the compound where the families of the police and the military live, and they were threatening children and women and so on. And so the perception is that he did the right thing. I, of course, think that violence begets violence, and if you don't take care of it, if you don't attack it straight on, it becomes a worse problem. We don't have the resources in Mexico that can equate to the resources that the criminal gangs have.
But the
Money and
Americans,
people.
the Americans are not willing to assist you on that, or is the government of Mexico refusing, saying we have our own agenda and we don't need American meddling in our affairs?
They are saying that. That's a traditional policy for Mexico. But the Americans could help without interfering with Mexico, without doing anything in Mexico, by stopping these trafficking of arms between the U.S. and Mexico. And they could also help by decriminalizing their drug consumption, which is unfortunately what feeds these criminal activities, most of them.
But I'm amazed what you're saying is the traffic coming in, which is logic. You have the feeling there are so many guards now at the borders, there are so many controls now at the borders, and it still comes in.
It still comes in.
So-
And there will and it'll still come in even if you build a 30-foot high wall the way Trump said he would. There's always ways to go around, under, or over.
Yeah, but also the other way around to the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely. But, when the expectations of, especially of economic migrants, not talking now about refugees or
Yes.
people who need asylum,
People who come from Guatemala.
but people
or from-
who are economic migrants, they have now gotten the message from the Trump administration that they won't be let into the U.S. Before, U.S. policy was rather liberal.
Yes.
As long as you got there, you could stay, waiting perhaps some years for your hearing to determine whether you could stay permanently or not, and then they just melted into the society in the U.S. Today, that's much more difficult. So the message has gotten across, and we have many fewer Central Americans.
But they're in Mexico. Many of them who can't
all,
go,
all
they
the
wait in
ones,
Mexico.
all the ones who tried to get into the United States and asked for asylum
Yeah.
are now back in Mexico, waiting in Mexico at the border, which is a very explosive situation because the border is not prepared for these migrants to live. Many of them in the streets, and they're not really being taken care of.
And the Mexican population will not like to. them
And
to
the
be there,
Mexican
so-
population has backlashed against it because, again, they take jobs or they take money or or they become petty criminals to be able to survive. There are now about maybe 40,000 of those at the border, which is not many for a country of 125 million. But they are massed in a very small corridor
And the
along
potential- and
the
the
border, and the
potential.
potential for violence, the potential for problems there is quite high. I think that the hope of the Americans, in any case, with this policy, is that all of these people will go home eventually. They'll be tired. They'll get tired of sitting
They
there.
probably settle in Mexico before they go home.
Well, some will settle in Mexico, which is fine. I mean, we
Yeah.
can absorb that without any difficulty. But already a fair number have gone home because they are not fleeing particular persecutions or
Gangs or
violence or
whatever.
gangs.
Yeah.
Most of them are economic migrants or families that want to meet up with their families in the U.S. who are already there legally and so on. So family reunification is one of the drivers of the migration flows.
Let me ask you a last question on the part of your neighbors of Mexico. If you go to the problems in Guatemala, in San Salvador, El Salvador, is there no way of finding a solution there?
Yeah, the solution is the solution of most emerging countries. That's development. So if we could find ways to develop that northern triangle of Central America, that would probably go a long way towards helping. The Mexican president has proposed this to Mr. Trump. Mexico doesn't have resources really to be able to plow into the northern part of Central America, and the U.S. has done the exact opposite. They have cut their aid.
They cut aid to
They
these
cut
countries.
the aid.
Yes.
So, they're shooting themselves in the foot at the end of the day because these people, when they no longer see any future for themselves in Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, because they move up north, even just to Mexico, where they have better opportunities than back home.
So, as a conclusion, you have to say, one has to say that violence, turmoil will continue for some time to come in these regions.
Well, I think the situation is different. Mexico, because of its neighborhood to the U.S., because of the migration issue, is a different case, for example, than Chile, where we saw an upsurge of totally spontaneous violence and unrest as a result of, I think, failed aspirations, promises made by the former government that were not kept. If you look at other parts of Latin America, you'll see different reasons.
Yeah.
What they all have in common is very much what the world unrest has in common among young people, among the middle classes, people who feel that they've been left aside, people who've not benefited from the globalized world in which we've been living for the last few decades, people who have no leadership. There's no leadership, it's rather spontaneous. Social media is what brings them out on the streets, and there's usually something that detonates the beginning, no? So in Hong Kong or in Beirut.
Like an Arab Spring.
Like an Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And that's happening very much in Latin America. It's happening in Colombia. It's happening in Chile. It's happening, obviously, we have the problem of Venezuela, not where there the demonstrations are against the government because of what Mr. Maduro has been doing. So it depends on the country. But I think we will see an unstable Latin America for the immediate future.
On these pessimistic notes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.